Something happened in late 2025 that Microsoft did not want you to pay close attention to, and the mainstream tech press barely covered it the way it deserved to be covered. On October 14th, 2025, Microsoft officially killed Windows 10, not with a dramatic announcement, not with a splashy event, just a quiet end-of-life notice that told over 500 million PC users that their operating system would no longer receive free security updates. Microsoft gave those users two choices: pay for extended security updates or upgrade to Windows 11, which requires hardware that tens of millions of perfectly functional computers simply do not have. What Microsoft did not count on, or perhaps chose to ignore, was a third option. An option that has been sitting right there, completely free, increasingly polished and increasingly capable, waiting for exactly this moment: Linux. And in the months that followed that October deadline, the numbers started moving in a way that the Windows ecosystem had not seen in years. Zorin OS alone recorded over 1 million downloads in the 2 months following Windows 10's end of life, with 78% of those downloads coming from Windows devices. Global Linux desktop market share crossed 4.7% in 2025, a 70% increase from where it stood just 3 years earlier. Linux gaming on Steam hit 5.33% by March 2026. These are not the numbers of a niche operating system for hobbyists anymore. Something real is happening. And today we are going to talk about 5 Linux distributions that are not just surviving alongside Windows, but actively pulling people away from it in ways that should genuinely concern the company Bill Gates built. Before we get into the 5 distributions specifically, it is worth spending a moment on why this particular moment in time is different from every other time Linux enthusiasts have declared the year of the Linux desktop. The reason previous predictions failed is well understood. Linux historically required too much technical knowledge for everyday users. Driver support was inconsistent. Software compatibility was limited. The experience felt foreign to anyone who had spent their entire computing life on Windows. Those barriers were real, and they kept Linux confined to servers, developers, and dedicated enthusiasts. But between 2022 and 2026, all 3 of those barriers weakened significantly and simultaneously. Valve's Proton compatibility layer made thousands of Windows games playable on Linux without modification. Hardware driver support improved across the board. And the distros we are about to discuss all made the deliberate decision to design their user interfaces specifically for people coming from Windows, lowering the transition cost to something that regular, non-technical users can manage. The combination of improved technology and a forced migration event created the conditions that previous predictions had been waiting for. The first distribution is Linux Mint, and if you have heard of any Linux distro besides Ubuntu, you have probably heard of Mint, because it has been the most recommended starting point for Windows switchers for almost a decade. What is different in 2026 is not Mint's existence, but its execution. The current release, Linux Mint 22.3, runs on the Cinnamon desktop environment, which looks and behaves in a way that anyone comfortable on Windows will understand. Almost immediately, the taskbar sits at the bottom. The application menu opens from the bottom left. File management works the way file management has always worked. The system tray behaves the way Windows users expect a system tray to behave. There's no radical redesign to learn, no philosophy of minimalism that strips away familiar touchpoints in the name of aesthetics. Mint's designers made a deliberate choice to prioritize familiarity over originality, and that choice has made it one of the most consistently popular desktop Linux distributions in the world for years running. What makes Mint particularly compelling as a Windows replacement is what it includes out of the box. Unlike many Linux distributions that ship a minimal installation and expect users to find and install what they need, Mint arrives with media codecs already installed, browser plugins ready, Java pre-configured, and DVD playback support built in. For the average person who just wants to open a browser, play a video, listen to music, and manage their files, Mint works from the first boot without requiring any additional setup. The software manager that ships with Mint is one of the cleanest and most approachable software installation interfaces in the Linux world, presenting applications in a curated, categorized store format that is far less intimidating than a terminal command. Mint is also among the most stable distributions available, built on Ubuntu's long-term support foundation, and maintained by a team that prioritizes not breaking things over incorporating the latest bleeding-edge changes. For someone who used Windows for 20 years and wants an operating system that simply gets out of the way and lets them work, Mint comes closer to that than any other Linux distribution. The second distribution is Zorin OS, and this is the one that has perhaps most directly positioned itself as the Windows 10 refugee S-first destination. Zorin OS 18 was built with one audience in mind above all others, people who know Windows and do not want to learn a completely different computing paradigm, but are no longer willing to stay on a platform that is pushing them toward hardware upgrades they cannot afford or do not want. to make. The centerpiece feature of Zorin OS is its appearance panel, which lets you switch your entire desktop layout between a Windows-style interface, a Mac OS-style interface, and several other options with a single click. You do not need to understand how Linux desktop environments work. You do not need to edit configuration files. You click once and the interface rearranges itself to match the environment you already know. Zorin also ships with what it calls Windows App Support, which uses wine and bottles under the hood to allow you to run many Windows applications directly on your Linux installation. This is significant because software compatibility has historically been one of the biggest reasons people stayed on Windows. Zorin does not eliminate this concern entirely, but it reduces it enough that the average user, who depends on a handful of specific Windows applications, can often keep using them without switching platforms entirely. The Zorin Connect feature integrates your Android phone with your desktop, allowing you to share files, mirror notifications, and use your phone as a remote control, features that Windows users moving from a tightly integrated ecosystem will find familiar. When Windows 10 hit its end-of-life date, Zorin saw record download numbers, including a stretch where it was pulling over 100,000 downloads in a single 2-day window. Those are not exploration numbers. Those are migration numbers. The third distribution is Pop! OS, developed by System76, and it represents a slightly different philosophy than the first two. Pop! OS is not specifically designed to look like Windows. Instead, it is designed to be the most functional, productive, and technically capable Linux desktop experience possible, built for people who want their computer to work efficiently rather than familiarly. The reason Pop! OS belongs on this list is that it catches a specific and growing segment of Windows users who are leaving not because their hardware got cut off, but because they are fed up with the direction Windows has taken as a product. The people who watched Microsoft force Copilot into Notepad, who watched Windows Recall get announced as a default on-screen surveillance feature, who watched their taskbar get progressively more cluttered with features they never requested, those people are not looking for a Linux distribution that reminds them of Windows. They are looking for one that reminds them of what an operating system is supposed to be. Pop! OS delivers that. Cosmic became stable in late 2025, and it represents one of the most significant pieces of new desktop Linux infrastructure in years. It is fast in a way that feels different from other Linux desktops. It is reliable in a way that comes from building something new, rather than maintaining decades of accumulated legacy code. The tiling window management built into Cosmic appeals to the kind of power users who have spent years fighting Windows to organize their screens the way they actually want them organized. Pop! OS is also one of the cleanest installations available in terms of what it does and does not do. There are no advertisements in the settings panel. There is no AI assistant generating unsolicited suggestions. There is no telemetry that the user did not explicitly agree to. For users leaving Windows, specifically because of what Windows became, Pop! OS is the answer to the question of what an operating system looks like when the company making it prioritizes the user. The fourth distribution is Fedora, and Fedora's place on this list comes from a different angle than the first three. Where Mint, Zorin, and Pop! OS are primarily winning over home users and general consumers, Fedora is the distribution quietly taking over among developers, engineers, and technical professionals who have historically been Windows users. Fedora is sponsored by Red Hat, which is now part of IBM, and it represents the cutting edge of what the Linux ecosystem can do. It ships with the absolute latest stable software, which means developers get access to new tools and new language versions faster than on any other mainstream distribution. The GNOME desktop that Fedora ships by default is clean, modern, and opinionated in a way that prioritizes focused work over decoration. What matters about Fedora's growth in the context of this conversation is what it represents at the enterprise level. When developers switch to Linux, they bring their workflows with them, and when those workflows become Linux native, the tools, documentation, and internal support, infrastructure of companies gradually shifts toward Linux as well. Red Hat's commercial Linux business generates billions in revenue annually, and Fedora serves as the upstream proving ground for that enterprise ecosystem. Every major cloud platform runs on Linux. Every major AI training infrastructure runs on Linux. The professional world that builds the software the rest of us use has been running on Linux for years. And the boundary between the professional ecosystem and the consumer desktop is becoming less distinct with every release cycle. The fifth distribution is Anduin OS, and this one is the newest and perhaps the most symbolically interesting entry on the list. Anduin OS was created by a former Microsoft engineer. That fact alone is worth pausing on. Someone who worked inside Microsoft, who understood the direction the company was taking Windows, who saw from the inside how product decisions were being made, chose to leave and build a Linux distribution. Anduin OS is built on Ubuntu and designed to look and behave like Windows 10, the version of Windows that hundreds of millions of people were using comfortably before Microsoft ended support for it. The interface uses pre-configured GNOME extensions to reproduce the Windows 10 taskbar layout, the application menu style, and the general desktop metaphor that users of that era know instinctively. There is no user data collection, no AI assistant running in the background, no telemetry being sent anywhere. The 1.3 release of Anduin OS addressed the most significant criticism the project had received, which was that installing applications required terminal commands that non-technical users found intimidating. Native FlatHub integration in the current version means users can browse and install thousands of applications from a graphical interface without ever opening a terminal. For the specific audience that Anduin OS is targeting, Windows 10 users who want to keep using a computer that looks and works like the computer they have been using for years, without the forced upgrade, without the hardware requirements, and without the surveillance features, it is a remarkably well-executed answer to a very specific and very large problem. The growth picture across all 5 of these distributions tells a coherent story when you look at it together. Linux's global desktop share grew 70% between 2022 and 2025. The United States crossed 5% Linux desktop adoption for the first time in recorded history in June 2025. India reached 16% Linux adoption, making it the leader among major economies. The Linux operating system market is projected to grow from approximately $22 billion in 2024 to nearly $100 billion by 2032, representing a compound annual growth rate of nearly 21%. These are not numbers from a platform in decline. These are numbers from a platform that found its moment. What is happening is not a sudden revolution. It is the accumulation of years of improvement reaching a tipping point at precisely the moment when Microsoft gave its users a hard deadline and a hardware requirement that a significant portion of them could not or would not meet. The 5 distributions covered today did not get lucky. They got ready. Linux Mint spent years refining stability and simplicity. Zorin OS spent years building tools specifically for Windows migrants. Pop! OS spent years building a new desktop environment from scratch. Fedora spent years serving the developer community. Anduin OS was built by someone who understood exactly what Windows users were losing and designed something to replace it. Each of these projects made deliberate choices over long periods of time that positioned them to catch the wave of users looking for an exit. The question for anyone watching this shift is not whether Linux is ready. The distributions described today prove that it is for an increasingly wide range of users and use cases. The question is whether the migration pressure that the Windows 10 end-of-life created, combined with the user frustration generated by Microsoft's Copilot saturation and hardware lock-in, is enough to sustain the growth trajectory these numbers are showing. The answer to that question will define the next chapter of desktop computing. But for the first time in a very long time, that question is genuinely open in a way it has not been before. The operating system that once seemed permanently dominant now has real, mature, user-friendly competitors actively taking its users. And the people who built those competitors built them specifically for this moment. There's a conversation happening inside the technology industry right now that rarely makes it to general audiences, and it goes something like this. For the past 2 decades, Windows dominated the desktop, not because it was the best option, but because it was the only practical option for most people. The ecosystem lock-in was total. Your software ran on Windows. Your hardware drivers were tested on Windows. Your IT department supported Windows. Your employer standardized on Windows. Switching was not a technical decision, it was a social and changed significantly. And what has changed is the institutional momentum. Developers who grew up on Linux at university are now in senior positions setting technology standards at companies. Cloud infrastructure that runs entirely on Linux has made Linux fluency a core professional skill rather than a niche one. The Steam Deck, which ships with SteamOS, put a Linux device in the hands of millions of mainstream consumers who would never have sought out Linux on their own. Each of these vectors introduced Linux to a new audience and added another node to an ecosystem that is now large enough to sustain itself in ways it could not a decade ago. The Proton compatibility layer that Valve developed for Steam is worth discussing, specifically because gaming was historically the single most cited reason that users could not switch from Windows. PC gaming meant Windows gaming. The titles users wanted to play, from major OA releases to competitive multiplayer games, were built for Windows, tested on Windows, and supported only on Windows. Proton changed this by creating a translation layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux with performance that in many cases matches or exceeds native Windows performance. Linux gaming on Steam reached 5.33% of all Steam users by March 2026, a number that would have seemed impossible to reach just 5 years earlier. When the gaming barrier falls, one of the last remaining reasons for a large category of users to stay on Windows falls with it. The privacy dimension of the Linux migration story deserves more attention than it typically receives in coverage that focuses primarily on technical features and market share numbers. The users who are actively choosing Linux in 2025 and 2026 are not all doing so because their hardware got cut off or because they could not afford Windows 11. A meaningful segment of them are leaving because of what Windows has become as a surveillance and advertising platform. The Windows recall story, in which Microsoft shipped a feature that took screenshots of your screen every few seconds and stored them in an unencrypted database, was not just a security scandal. It was a signal about the direction of the product. Copilot integration in Notepad, Paint, and the taskbar was not just an inconvenience. It was evidence of a company that had decided its operating system's primary purpose was to serve Microsoft's AI business rather than its users. For people who reach that conclusion, Linux is not just a technical alternative, it is a philosophical one. You get an operating system that does what you tell it to do, that does not send your behavioral data anywhere you did not choose, and that does not push commercial features into the applications you use to write shopping lists. The 5 distributions we covered today represent different entry points into that alternative. Linux Mint for the user who wants familiarity and stability above everything else. Zorin OS for the Windows 10 user who wants to replicate their existing workflow as closely as possible. Pop OS for the user who is done with operating systems that treat them as a product rather than a customer. Fedora for the developer or technical professional who needs cutting-edge tools in a stable, well-maintained environment. Anduin OS for the user who wants the Windows 10 they already knew, rebuilt on a foundation that is not going anywhere and is not going to start charging them to keep using it. None of these require the user to become a Linux expert. None of them require command line knowledge for everyday use. None of them require a new hardware purchase, and none of them cost a single dollar. Whether this moment translates into the durable market shift that Linux advocates have been predicting for years will depend on factors that go beyond the quality of the software. Application developers will need to prioritize Linux versions of their tools. Hardware manufacturers will need to maintain driver support. Enterprise IT departments will need to add Linux to their official support lists. These institutional changes take time, and some of them are further along than others. But the distributions that exist today are genuinely ready for the users who are ready for them. The gap between what Linux can offer and what it has historically been perceived to offer has closed more in the past 3 years than in the previous 20. The question Windows users need to ask themselves is not whether Linux is ready for them. The question is whether they are ready to find out. Consider what this moment looks like for an ordinary person sitting on a Windows 10 machine that works perfectly fine. Their computer boots quickly. It runs everything they need. The hardware is in good shape. Microsoft's end-of-life decision did not break their computer. What it did was turn a functioning, reliable machine into a security liability on an artificial deadline. Linux turns that forced choice into a real one. That same machine can run Linux Mint or Zorin OS fast, and more reliably than it ever ran Windows 10, because these distributions are designed to be efficient rather than to push hardware upgrades. Hundreds of thousands of users who made the switch report that their old hardware felt new again. That dynamic is the thing that makes this moment genuinely different. The distributions are better, the timing is right, and the alternative Microsoft is offering has never been less appealing.